So, elephant in the room. Are these bloody knees meta? For this, I have done a bunch of testing, and there's one weird thing which Dispatch, shout out Dispatch, pointed out, which I did see, but I didn't quite register it, but we'll get into that in a minute. Now, I've done a bunch of testing with these knees, and I've done a bunch of legendary missions, mostly DUA, because I know it the most, and as well as the fact it's probably the easiest. With just a normal strikers build, strikers using turmoil, and then negotiators. I timed them, I tallied the amount of times I died, why I died, whether it was a dumb mistake, or etc, etc, etc. Time-wise, it's kind of hard to basically put a metric on that, just because I'm not the best player, especially when doing legendary solo. I get irritated, annoyed, and impatient, and just make stupid mistakes. So a lot of that is going to be down to skill issue and player error. However, death-wise, I can promise you now I died the most using turmoil, mostly just because something would just decide I'm going to rush him, and my damage is cutting half, and because I don't have that single target damage, I'd either take a shotgun to the face, get punched in the face, drones in the face. Like, trying to actually manage close quarter combat with turmoil, especially on legendary, was near impossible, and it was even worse if there were two enemies coming at me, which I'll get into in a minute. Now, in terms of overall capability and pushing, especially when it came to single target, if I did get rushed, negotiators absolutely did outperform turmoil, but this is mostly just because I pick where negotiators is damaging. With turmoil, not so much. However, when it came to comparing strikers with and without turmoil, honestly, in terms of overall performance, they're near enough identical. The main issue being whether or not you get pushed. However, the second difference is just the fact that if you are using turmoil, you're mostly forced into using the striker's backpack I was using the obliterate chest, which is what you're watching now. However, the other difference is the simple fact that striker's backpack is no longer best in slot. Utilizing something like unstoppable force or vigilance is performing better, especially if you're going Cheska Grupo. It is just outright performing better. So the largest difference when it came to comparing strikers with and without turmoil is just the fact that without turmoil, it is overall a stronger build. It's like 13% stronger in just overall DPS, and that's just assuming that you somehow have the magical capability to have all of turmoil's damage go where you want it, which you don't. Why is not controlling where that damage goes such a huge problem? Well, the example that was given to me by Rousey, shout out Rousey, was the Lovebirds, that dynamic duo from the Incursion. Typically, we kill the fat one first, so if you're shooting the fat one with turmoil, fat one takes 50% damage, and then the skinny one, because we're using turmoil, will also take 50% damage. That is assuming that nothing else is on the map, which normally you start by clearing ads, so it should just be the two Lovebirds. Now, there is another problem with this, and that is just quite simply, they periodically spawn other ads. While it is the two of them, you have 100% effective DPS. Your DPS is going exactly where you want it to be. However, when other ads start spawning, because of turmoil, that damage is going to jump around, and there's 4 ads. And as we've discussed, you don't control where it goes, which effectively cuts your DPS down to an effective DPS of where you want it, where you need it, down to about 60%. That's just 4 ads. So yeah, just that mechanic alone on them basically just removes them from being a meta piece. Now, if we had a way to control it, or if it prioritized the enemies closest, then maybe I could get behind these. I still think there'd be a bit of a problem when it comes to single target DPS, just because, okay, Lovebirds, maybe a bit of a stretch, but Rushers aren't exactly hard to deal with, but most of the time when we're dealing with them, we have single target DPS. Now, cut your DPS in half. And if you've now got 2 Rushers coming at you, nothing on Turmoil says that that shared damage is going to go to the second Rusher. If we could prioritize it, like having it target the nearest enemy to the one we're shooting, then fine. But it doesn't do that. It jumps around all over the place, which really fucks with the dynamic of a lot of builds, as well as, in a weird way, your survivability. But then if you are running something like Preservation or Gunner, you can actually get a weird amount of survivability from using something like Turmoil, which is like one of the few upsides of it. Then comes the problem that despite the fact that Bewildered, the talent on Turmoil, says that it splits the damage 50-50, it very clearly isn't, and it can even have a crit proc on the target you're shooting, but for some weird reason the crit doesn't transfer over, or for some... The weirdest problem, realistically, is the damage that does transfer over seems to be, most of the time, higher than your initial shot damage, which is just completely and utterly bizarre. I then started running tests in order to focus down a certain group of enemies within the shortest time possible, and if anything, this just highlighted the problem with the whole shared damage side of it completely, just because trying to get a fast time on the left hand range, and just because you're damaging everything else other than potentially what it is you're wanting to damage, it ended up being really bad, often getting 3 to 4 seconds slower, which is nothing to do with skill issue. If we got like half a second maybe, but 3 to 4 seconds slower compared to a normal Strikers build, which was getting about 11.6 seconds on average, whereas Turmoil was getting 14 or 15 seconds, normally 14.2 to 15.6 normally. And then I threw in Negotiators just to show the difference of what happens when you actually control where your damage is going. So you got 6.4 seconds. So in terms of removing groups, Negotiators is still going to be the absolute winner. You just have to manually do it. So far we have, it picks and chooses randomly what on-kill talents it actually wants to activate. It will activate Armor on Kill, both from Gunner, Armor on Kill perks from brand sets such as Palisade or Bellstone, and it will even activate the Armor on Kill from something along the lines of Hunter's Fury. It also activates Preservation. However, despite the fact that it also activates Unstoppable Force, it doesn't activate the on-kill talent for things like Negotiators, Hunter's Fury's damage buff. It actively interferes with how Negotiators as a whole works drastically by around 50%. I don't know the actual math yet. That's going to take a little bit of brainstorming, but actively reduces your single target DPS, which is arguably the most important stat in the game, as it's what actually, 1, keeps you alive, 2, allows you to kill enemies. The actual stat itself is not 50-50. It interacts weirdly with damage to armor and damage to health for some weird reason. I've noticed depending on what I'm hitting, sometimes it will hit an armor. I'm hitting armor anyway. It does absolutely nothing for or against armor plating, so the damage won't transfer to an armor plated target, and hitting an armor plated target won't transfer damage anyway. It actively invites aggro from surrounding areas within a 30-meter radius, and can, depending on the situation, rushers, lovebirds, a variety of other areas, which I'll leave to your imagination, reduces your overall capable effective DPS because you're hitting things you don't need to be hitting. Someone explain to me how these are meta without saying Headhunter. We've got another video coming for that. Without saying Headhunter, someone explain to me how these are meta. These effectively only really work on high-end DPS builds, striker builds, maybe Heartbreaker builds. It depends on whether or not Heartbreaker is actually even working correctly yet, or whether it's still being weird and stacking incorrectly, but potentially high-end DPS, which for me as a notion is still weird, because why would you go high-end DPS when you can just go Strikers as DPS and it just functions better and does more? Unless you're that weird guy in my comment section for my previous video who tried telling me that Strikers is not a DPS build. Weird. And potentially Heartbreaker, and that's assuming it's working correctly. Basically every other set where these could be used to a high degree or even remotely efficiently, they either nerf or actively interact in a negative way with. Nerf, I suppose. So what's the point in them? Everyone's ranting and raving about these friggin' knee pads, and basically the only thing you can work them on is friggin' Strikers. And yet everyone's still really bored of using Strikers. But we love these knees. interesting. Really interesting. Yes, Headhunter, I'm aware. Like I said, that deserves its own entire video because there's a very weird interaction happening with these knees and Headhunter as a whole, which I need to go over. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. These knees are not meta. Have fun. Good luck. Don't die. It's bad for the health.